And already Trump has talked about giving Charlie Kirk the Medal of Freedom as a way of trying to, they're going to elevate him, and they're going to try to do what they can via social media and other media that's available to ensure that this does not seem like this is another fairly indecipherable act of violence, and that it is seen as very freighted with political significance.
Professor Will Davies is a sociologist and political economist writing on a whole range of diverse topics, including neoliberalism, happiness science, environmental politics, and anti-expert politics. He's also the author of many impactful books, such as The Happiness Industry and Nervous States. Professor Davies, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast is being recorded 2 days after the shooting of conservative political activist Charlie Kirk, and is probably going to be published sometime next week. So at this time, we still don't know who the killer is and what his motives were. Not that that's going to stop the conspiracy mill from happily churning on. However, people are proclaiming this killing as some sort of a watershed moment in the political history of the US. I mean, this stuff is already having real life consequences. This is unverified now, but I just saw a video of a black man being savagely beaten because he apparently said "fuck Charlie Kirk." And of course, there's a healthy dose of lunatic MAGA influencers who have been calling for retaliatory violence against the Democrats about 20 seconds after the man got killed. On the other hand, there probably isn't anything as genuinely American as assassinations of high-profile political figures. I mean, throughout its history. Pick a decade and you'll have dozens of senators, activists, and even presidents who have been at least shot at, if not killed, to pick from. So do you think the killing of Charlie Kirk is a genuine sign of the ground shaking in the US and the West? Or are we in the more, are we in the more kind of more of the same kind of territory, and this will all blow over once the dust settles?
So everything is about the interpretation of it. And as you've already alluded to, there's already some huge amount of online framing of it by the right, that this is the beginning of some new kind of civil war. There's a lot of voices on the MAGA right, including people like Elon Musk and others, who would welcome an opportunity to initiate a more sort of, I suppose, a more literally violent version of the culture wars, something which might give additional permission to get troops out into cities, but also particularly to crack down on particular areas of higher education, which has already obviously been going on. But we know from the history of fascism in Italy in the early 1920s and in Germany in the early 1930s that these kinds of moments can be extremely pivotal in terms of giving apparent empirical evidence for what the far right has already been claiming about the incipient revolutionary threat of the radical left. I mean, this fascism begins as a counter-revolutionary mobilization against some perceived insurrection coming from the left. There was a key moment in the rise of Mussolini in the 1920s with the Diana Theatre bombing, which was a failed anarchist attempt at an assassination, but which led to this martyrdom that was developed by the fascists of the victims of that bombing, so as to basically ram home in people's imaginations that they were under imminent threat from communists. And already Trump has talked about giving Charlie Kirk the Medal of Freedom as a way of trying to, they're going to elevate him, and they're going to try to do what they can via social media and other media that's available to ensure that this does not seem like this is another fairly indecipherable act of violence, and that it is seen as very freighted with political significance. So I guess that means that for those who want to, the problem is that the way to oppose that is to try to get to the bottom of what's actually happened, who the killer actually was, what were their actual intentions and ideas, and you'd probably discover quite late on that this was a far messier, more complicated agenda than the right would like there to be. I mean, already yesterday, the Wall Street Journal was publishing some rumor that I think is completely unverified, that there were these statements
Slogans
of gender
on the
ideology on the
yeah.
gun itself, which in a way, I mean, it made me think back to the Christchurch massacre, where somebody opened fire in a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, and was live streaming himself with all of these kind of slogans from outright online media, and sort of shouting, "Subscribe to PewDiePie," the radical right gamer. I mean, sometimes you get these acts of murder that are extremely explicit in their stated ideologies. And of course, the right would like to find that there was something like that. Unfortunately, I think we need to, given the politicization of the FBI and all these other things, we probably need to treat all of the evidence that now comes out about, because apparently just today, someone has been taken into custody. I think we have to be quite suspicious of what gets released to the media about the identity of this person and what their background was, because there's going to be so much political weight placed upon them being a radical left activist with a particular ideological axe to grind.
I mean, and on the other hand, do we even know about the guy who tried to assassinate Trump? We still don't know about his motives, and it's been like,
no. I mean, these things tend to be a muddle, really. I mean, it's sort of in lots of these situations. I mean, whenever often people talk about when someone went and opened fire in a gay nightclub in Florida, that sort of act gets interpreted as some kind of lone wolf killer with mental health issues. So there's always a sort of you get these different framings get created, but normally I think at the heart of these things is someone who's got all sorts of disturbances in their lives, and they don't fit tidily into categories.
and probably doesn't help that, I mean, America, like any other place, is dealing with increasing mental illness issues, but it
Yeah,
doesn't have
sure.
a national free healthcare plan,
Sure.
and it's
And it's got
full of
guns all over
guns,
the
and it's
place.
full of
Yeah,
guns. Yeah.
yeah, it's full of guns. So that's the really frightening thing. And I'm not saying I would be necessarily scared for my life, but I mean, I think if or maybe one would be, I don't know. But I mean, if we know from the precedent of the way, say, Orban has worked in Hungary, that there are particular areas of quote unquote woke scholarship that become a kind of proxy for their idea of what the radical left is, in particular gender studies and post-colonial studies. And I think, I mean, although of course what the hell's that got to do with an assassination of this guy? Well, of course he was Turning Point. His organization was notorious and spread fear amongst academics already for the way in which it tried to kind of isolate particular individuals. It created lists of people who were considered to be political activists and tried to make them feel afraid of being kind of exposed, or afraid of what they're how conservative students might respond to them and so on. So I think that there is already a connection there with what's going on campuses, and we know that obviously the attempt to crack down on the particular theoretical currents and critical theory on campuses has always been a very noted aspect of the current Trump agenda and the kind of Heritage Foundation ideas that have circled around it over recent years.
I wanted to ask actually this with my opener. What kind of a system are we actually living in right now? Because this bizarre consortium of ill-adjusted tech bros and senile octogenarian politicians running the entire circus doesn't seem to resemble any sort of neoliberal free market capitalism of my youth anymore, not even in a fever dream.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have my own preferred name for it. You're probably familiar with some of the names that get thrown around. People talk about techno feudalism, which is partly, I think the appeal of the concept of feudalism right now stems from various things. I mean, one is that there is this extreme inequality that's developing, particularly wealth inequality of these kind of quasi medieval figures of Bezos and Zuckerberg and so on, whose wealth amounts to is on a scale that is greater than vast populations. I think the other thing is the marginalization of the labor market, because capitalism, a central institution of capitalism by basically any account, not just a Marxist one, but part of the question of how capitalism arose in early modern times is the question of how did wage labor come about? And we are clearly moving in the direction of something in which the labor market, based around the pricing and the selling of labor, is being steadily marginalized. Maybe not in the sense that people no longer sell their time for money, because clearly they do, but that it is losing its, I guess you could say, hegemonic position within the legitimation and the organization of profit making and of extraction, partly because we know that we have all of these, the owners of these platforms that are now the wealthiest men in the United States. They don't really generate very much employment, these corporations, and the area where there's been this extraordinary scale of entirely speculative investment in AI infrastructure and data centers which to support it, which there's much debate and discussion at the moment as to whether or not this whole thing could just kind of pop, and that if it doesn't deliver in any sense, then you're just going to have a huge amount of overinvestment in things that actually don't render themselves worthwhile. So that, you've got an entire kind of nation at the moment, or international system, willing this infrastructure and these investments into something that will work, but there's no guarantee that they will. But again, that is something which is almost premised on the idea that vast swathes of the labor market can just be effectively kind of eradicated, particularly in white collar work. So there's that sort of feudal thesis. I think that, and then there's a neo-feudalism, techno-feudalism. I, in my own work, have written a couple of things in the last decade. I mean, some of this was in my first book, The Limits of Neoliberalism, where I tried to understand post-global financial crisis capitalism, that is the global financial crisis of 2008, as a form of neoliberalism that exists in a kind of state of exception, that is without, without the resources to justify itself, legally, hegemonically, morally, and that in that sense it involves constant kind of operating in a spirit of constant contingency. And this is actually, I saw that Adam Tooze had, in a recent Substack essay, when talking about the relationship between the White House and Columbia University, which is where he works, talking about this not as fascism, but as a form of, I can't remember the word he used, but effectively a kind of constant contingent governance, that is, instead of governing via principles, rules, systems, and norms, which is really what capitalism is built upon to some extent, and certainly capital and financial capital welcome predictability of politics above all else. But instead, you've got this kind of constant deal making. Everything becomes a kind of contingent deal to be made here, and the separation of politics and economics kind of falls apart effectively, because if somebody pisses off President Trump overseas, then suddenly he might slap a tariff on some business where they have some kind of interest in it. So that this sort of everything becomes about deal making, the sort of deal making state. Now that's a more kind of, in some ways, even more crisis prone system than the one that I was talking about in relation to, which was more in the sort of immediate post 2008 period. But I think you've got elements of neoliberalism, but which lacking the overarching narrative, which allowed ideas of meritocracy, of competition, of inequality, but sort of earned inequality. Those sorts of narratives and normative and legal resources that allowed neoliberalism to achieve a hegemony before 2008, they've been abandoned. And instead, what you have is a more kind of nakedly sovereigntist version of neoliberalism, in which some of that sovereignty, I think we do have to accept, as some of it has sort of drifted out to these platform owners that do have powers that I think can be understood more along the lines of sovereignty than along the lines of economic categories of. I mean, obviously, it's rentier capitalism. That much is clear, that the profits depend on rents from property rights. But there is also something that feels quasi-feudal in the sense that forms of sovereignty have drifted out from the state towards some of these other kind of baronial figures.
People talk about libertarian authoritarianism as well, but I'm a little bit confused because I thought the whole point of libertarianism is that its most elementary guiding principle is that they want the government to basically piss off and, let's sell off the fire department and the hospitals to some monopoly tycoon. So there's no interference in trade whatsoever, because what we have right now seems like the opposite of that. Like you just explained, it's just some sort of weird deal-making scheme.
So I'm just sort of thinking through some different categories that we can use for this, and one of the distinctions that I have found quite useful in trying to understand some of this in recent years is a distinction between, which you find in the work of someone like Michel Foucault, for instance, between sovereignty, which is a kind of heavily centralized, ultimately violent power that resides in particular, that is a kind of reserve of power that is manifest in the ability to wage violence, to wage war, to also to suspend the law, which is what Carl Schmitt asserted, versus a different idea of power, which is government. And government is that which operates through bureaucracies, through the maintenance of data archives, through the delivery and the optimization of various interventions in the economy and in society. And it's what allows there to be things like a public health policy. It allows there to be, if you have an agenda for, say, the management of a pandemic, or if you say we want to have, all children being able to read by a certain age, these sorts of things. These are kind of clearly political objectives, but they don't work through sovereignty. They work through government, and government is more about achieving. This is what Foucault stressed. Government is more about achieving effective networks of expertise and information between central bureaucratic bodies and more kind of arm's length entities, such as maybe hospitals or schools, but also conscripting various alliances through the forms of centers of expertise and audit and regulation and so on. And I think in a way, one way of understanding authoritarian libertarianism, which, as you say, sounds like a paradox, is that it is a kind of an attack by sovereign power on governmental power. And you can see this very clearly in, say, although Elon Musk has stood down from Doge now, Doge was an instance of this. And it wasn't even, it said it was going to save money. It didn't even successfully save any money because it attacked the tax base so badly. It attacked the ability to raise taxes because it was also going after the IRC, the revenue raising body in the United States, the tax office. That actually, I think fiscally, it'll turn out to actually be a kind of net negative. But ideologically, it made it much harder. And obviously, there was also the attack on US aid, the ability to development programs. You've also got what Robert F. Kennedy is doing in relation to public health policy, which is just kind of insane. Kind of this sort of anti-vax, anti-public health agenda. Meanwhile, you've got troops on the streets of Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. So you've got this huge assertion of one kind of power, but a great withdrawal of another kind of power. And there is an ideological genealogy here. I mean, there's recently been some really good books on an aspect of the right that was rather overlooked because people just thought it was too weird and crazy. There's the Quinn Slobodian's book Hayek's Bastards, which is a book about what happened to elements of the neoliberal intellectual scene over the course of I guess, particularly after the fall of communism, that the enemy of many conservative neoliberals had been defeated. And so they began to find new enemies elsewhere. And those enemies included agendas for racial equality, for gender equality, agendas for to try to develop the global South and to achieve greater inequality, and also agendas around preventing climate change. That these sorts of things became the new enemy, and that particular factions of the libertarian neoliberal right started to mobilize against that. And the key figure for in much of this was Murray Rothbard, who was really the leading voice of what you could, he would have said libertarianism or paleo-libertarianism, but it certainly had strong authoritarian dimensions, because in order to try to attack, the sources of what he would have considered to be socialism inside the federal government and inside whatever, might be the European Commission or whatever it might be, you need to have some quite strong authoritarian instruments of power in order to attack the state. So one bit of the state is attacking another bit of the state, but also this agenda was fervently anti immigration and very suspicious of racial integration and of multiculturalism, on the basis that, and this is what Slobodian's book is very good at demonstrating, that it held these people, many of these people held on to quite biological racist ideas of inequality, and they believed that mixing and of breeding between different races was ultimately from some kind of Darwinist perspective was going to be a negative outcome. And clearly someone like Elon Musk now subscribes to this kind of worldview. There is these sorts of ideas that only kind of 15 years ago would have been considered to be belong only on the worst forms of outright message boards and so on, have now got kind of roots directly to the mainstream of American politics, and I think are also circulating around European politics quite a lot. The other book, which is worth reading if people are interested in this, is When the Clock Broke by John Gans, which is also about a very similar period in American history of the early 1990s, when he shows that with things like the shock jocks like Rush Limbaugh, the Pat Buchanan campaign for the Republican nomination in 1992, and Rothbard was also sort of circling here. But you have this moment where a really extreme version of what can only really be described as the far right agenda suddenly gets roused. It's just that it then sort of disappears again, and people forget about it, and it's really come back very, very strongly and explicitly in the last few years.
What is the ultimate aim then? Just like an absence of state? You said it's like a part of state battling another part of that same state.
I think
what is the aim
I guess
of these?
You would say,
yeah.
I mean, I think you could say that a restoration of both racial and gender inequality. I think a reversal of the gains of feminism and of civil rights. I mean, Mark Andreessen, who is a venture capitalist and the founder of, he was the founder of the first web browser, Mosaic, back in the 90s. He was the founder of Substack. He was a pretty kind of centrist liberal guy. He was sort of pro-Clinton, pro-Obama, so on. And he kind of got radicalized in the last few years. But he wrote this techno utopian manifesto on his blog a year or two ago.
That's usually a bad sign.
Yeah, exactly. But he says, that we have, I think it was 2023, 24. And he says this country has, I can't remember how he puts it, but effectively has lost its way. The years he used was over the last 60 years. He said 60 years. Now, if you go back 60 years before, whenever that was, 2022, 23, I think it was, something like that. You're back before the American Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act, which Lyndon Johnson signed in 1965, saying with the words, I think I just lost the South, this famous moment in the establishment of democracy, really, in the United States. This is something which I think could now be seen as a kind of, a wrong turn by aspects of the Silicon Valley right, in a way that, you only go back to the Obama years and they wouldn't have countenanced anything of the sort. So this has happened quite quickly. But equally, I think gender inequality, the gains of feminism, this is something, I mean, leaving aside that obviously there are things that they would be far more explicit about in relation to gender identity and issues around trans, and those are sorts of things that where they've been much more kind of explicit and outspoken. But I think that, it's becoming clear that the gains of feminism since the 1960s also need to be reversed. And I think, that means that you have a restoration. And someone like J.D. Vance is relatively explicit about this, that you have a restoration of a certain version of the patriarchal family unit as the basis for economic and independence and social care. And that way you don't need to have those forms of government, to go back to the distinction I was making earlier. But you do have potentially a very strong form of kind of police state, and you have very strong borders. And you attack. I mean, we know this is already happening. You try and attack the sources of so-called woke ideology in all sorts of areas, of whether it be the funding and governance of museums and art galleries in the cultural sector, in our education, and so on. And clearly, there's a lot of bullying already going on in relation to higher education, to try to get them to change their hiring practices and their curricula as a condition of continuing to receive federal income. And I mean, where where MAGA have been, quite smart in some ways, and I don't think that, as I recall, I don't think this was nearly such an agenda in the first Trump administration, is the recognition that there are all sorts of parts of society that are vulnerable to fiscal disruption, and that and this is what Trump keeps saying. We can just withdraw. We can get people to come and sort of beg and comply with us as a condition of continuing to receive federal income. That, I think, that use of the fiscal state as a way to advance particular cultural agendas and programs is something that is, clearly was planned, and is a key part of their program.
What's with this weird obsession with the 60s, presenting as some sort of like a go-to utopia every time, where everything was just perfect? I was just like watching a documentary, and almost everybody that was notable was killed in the 60s. JFK, Bobby Kennedy, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. Like, it doesn't seem like a very pleasant time
50s,
for anybody.
I think
it's the 50s.
For MAGA, it's the 50s that they want. I mean, or you could, it's either the 50s, it's either the 1950s, or it's the 1850s. I mean, that's the it's like no, but I mean, there is a kind of, there is a sort of radical reactionary vision which goes the whole way back to something, a sort of pre-Civil War America. Let's say the slightly more I mean, after all, so they've managed to reverse Roe v. Wade, the abortion ruling. That was early 1970s. The Civil Rights Act of 1965, I think, they haven't explicitly said that they want to annul that, but it's, there's been, voter suppression in the United States has been so endemic in recent years that it's perfectly clear that that racist policies around voting rights have been in effect for some, exactly, and various other ways of keeping black people from voting. So I think 1950s, pre-feminism, pre-civil rights, certainly pre-abortion. I think that the interpretation of the 1960s and 1970s is that there was a culture war that was led by the kind of draft dodging middle class graduates, hippies, but maybe not even the hippies. I mean, maybe someone like Bill Clinton. These sort of people who are people who are let's just call them
hardly
liberals,
a revolutionary though. But
no, exactly. I mean, I think so it's now the term that is thrown around a lot is the professional managerial class, which consists of people who basically went to university, work in either the public sector or education or the liberal media or some other professional services, and that these people have basically kind of won over the last 60 years. It's their agenda that has basically won, and in spite of Reagan and in spite of Bush Jr. or whatever, these people have basically taken over the country, and that the other side has basically been defeated over and over and over again. That's I think the diagnosis that the MAGA right would make. Which is not that different. I mean, just, we see this elements of this in Europe. I mean, there are people around Nigel Farage in the UK and around the Brexit agenda, which would say that in some these people, a lot of them are, they say they basically think that Tony Blair is almost still in power. They're so sort of obsessed with a certain vision of liberal, sort of socially liberal hegemony, that they refuse to accept that the right has even got anywhere near power for the last sort of 40 years. It's quite
Haven't the
bizarre.
Conservatives been in power for the past 14 years before
Yeah,
Labour
exactly. I
took
know, and
over?
they kind of almost like deny that, and it's very strange. Well, they would say that some sort of woke elite has actually been in power because they're the ones who staff the civil service and they control the universities and the museums and the schools and all this sort of stuff, and the media, BBC. Anyway, but so they would say that that's what's been going on, and that we've just been losing over and over and over again, and now finally we're going to start fighting back, and this is how we have to do it. That's roughly how the narrative works.
If we go back to whatever this system that we live in now is there perhaps a better summary of our times than this recent cringe fest of a dinner at the White House where Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Altman from OpenAI, and the rest of these awkward CEO penguins were just pitifully groveling at the feet of the Mad Czar, publicly lavishing him with ever more extravagant adjectives before they were able to get a word in themselves. I mean, these are pretty mad scenes, and we're just acting like this is the new normal now.
I mean, no, it's I don't know I don't think there's other than some sort of other than monarchy or something, or just sort of, it's tempting to diagnose the problem psychiatrically. I mean, there's clearly a kind of narcissistic personality disorder of some kind going on, or possibly dementia or whatever with Trump himself, which is a factor, because it's clear that he's got a very slim grip on reality. So there's that. And I think clearly they have business interests in all of this. They want to. Apple has particular business interests in trying to avoid the tariffs in relation to its business interests in manufacturing interests in China, and they all believe that that they can work with the state to pursue their interests in artificial intelligence, and I mean, in some cases, in things like crypto. So this is the first step towards doing so. I mean, it's pretty humiliating that they had to get filmed doing all of that. But I mean, they're treating him now like a kind of a sort of medieval monarch who needs this kind of behavior is a way of beginning some kind of negotiation. It's hard to know what more to say about it than that, because it is so weird. It's clearly not normal in any sense, and it's pretty. It's hard to think how the US presidency, or for that matter, kind of the US corporate executive class, can recover ever from that kind of spectacle, because how can anyone come along and achieve and try to sort of recreate some kind of credibility, let alone some kind of moral credibility, when these offices have been kind of sort of trashed and treated in that way.
Yeah, at the end of the day, can we really talk of a system of any kind here at all? I mean, isn't this, like you said, just a bunch of like greedy men suffering from narcissism disorders and delusions of grandeur? Because, for example, it doesn't look like Donald Trump has any sort of a program, really. Sure, he's got a few talking points that he keeps repeating, but we would be like kind of hard pressed to find a shred of any kind of a coherent political thought there. He's not suddenly going to pull out a quote from Milton Friedman out of his head or something.
No, not he. No, he won't. But I think there is a background. I mean, there has been a lot of thinking done about this version of this Trump administration, unlike, I think, 2016. So there's the Project 2025 document, which a lot of people have studied to try and understand where these ideas came from. The agenda with tariffs, I think, has been, it's not, although it was kind of comically, there was something just sort of absurd, like a game show, about the way he kind of initially unveiled it on that Freedom Day. Clearly, this is an agenda that some people have actually got a stake in to some extent. And the attempt to drastically re-engineer the federal government, to shrink it, to reduce its obligations to certain sections of the population, but also to things like the environment, to the global south. There is a kind of, I guess that's the America First agenda. is that the US federal government remains. I mean, after all, America First is as an idea is premised on the idea that US hegemony is over, that the US is no longer some kind of global power, and therefore what reserves of power it has, whether that be in the Federal Reserve or in the Pentagon or wherever else, now needs to be put to the service purely of the United States of America as a national project, and that it doesn't owe anything to anyone. But that also involves obviously a shrinkage of who is considered to be a member of that national community, which is where ICE comes in, and this deportation agenda, and the frankly sadistic way in which that is being carried out and bragged about via the media and social media. So I think these things, there is a kind of a coherent agenda here, and some people will call it fascist, some people will call it mercantilist, some people will say that it's a kind of symptom of post-hegemonic decline and so on. But I think bits of it do add up. I think that the curious thing is that Trump himself has this mania and speaks incoherently, generates a lot of. I mean, he's very, very good televisual content. I mean, there's no question of that. I mean, it's very difficult not to focus on him and talk about him, and as we're doing right now. Yeah, it's that adds an element of theatre to the whole thing. But I think in the background, you could say there is something more steady and purposeful going on.
Couldn't we just call this a case of the good old-fashioned oligarchy?
Yeah, sure. No, that's right. And I think that's what, someone like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez I mean, when Trump first got in, they went on their sort of stump tour of the United States trying to talk about taking on the oligarchs. So I think that's right. And I mean, the other thing which is obviously to say about Trump is it's clear that he's exploiting his office for private financial gain and for the gain of his family, like to a crazy extent. I mean, they are just raking in billions of pounds for their own private into their own private accounts through the use of the presidency as a business opportunity. I mean, he remains a kind of grubby businessman basically, and so do his sons. So that there's also that going on. I mean, the other there was a nice paper done. The US sociologist Dylan Riley, when Trump got in initially in 2016 and people were asking, what do we say about, people were saying, is this populism or is it fascism or what is this? And Dylan Riley went back and read work by the great sociologist Max Weber on different forms of authority. And Weber is famous for distinguishing traditional authority from bureaucratic, from charismatic, as being the kind of three different, what he called ideal types of authority. But Riley pointed out that there is actually an additional type of authority that he thinks helps explain Trump, which is what he calls patrimonial authority, where effectively political office becomes indistinguishable from the household, and the Trump family, which is, he was in the first term he was appointing his
Jared
daughter
Kushner
and Kushner to various offices, but also the way his sons have always sort of hovered around him in various ways. But effectively, the household and the public office, the distinction between the two blurs, it sort of dissolves basically. And that for Weber, it's a defining feature of modern public office, that there is a distinction between the role you play in your office and the role you play in private. And these two get kept very separate, which is why, if a civil servant is found to be taking money from a private source, this is a scandal, But for Trump, it's not a scandal at all. It's just complete common sense. It is a completely obvious thing to be doing, is that you're in this position, you've got this fame, and you've got all of these opportunities, and you just take all of them. Who was it? He got given that jumbo jet. I mean, that was sort of surreal. Do you remember? I mean, so much happens. It's easy to forget what happened only like 2 months ago. But was in
I'm
the
still
state
with
of
the golden sneakers and
all
Trump's
that
own
stuff, and
cryptocurrency. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All that. I mean, it's just surreal, and there's so much of it that it's hard to keep track. But it's not. There's no sense of that there's even anything wrong being done, and that, I think, is why understanding this along some pre-modern vision of patrimonial authority does at least explain how it's what its own internal logic is.
Now, I don't labor under a misapprehension that this unholy alliance between big business and the state began under Trump. It was obviously happening under the Democrats too. But these so-called tech titans that you already mentioned, Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, etc., were literally posing with Trump during the inauguration, like they are part of the administration, and that was probably intended to send a pretty clear message, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think. I mean, they are obviously a different type of businessman from the executives that we've seen in the last, I guess at least for the last 100 years. I mean, there are sometimes analogies made between the so-called robber barons and the people like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan in the late 19th century, where certain individuals' wealth took off out of all proportion to the growth in incomes and wealth anywhere else, and granted them a form of political and cultural power that would not be available to just a regular kind of business executive. So they already have that kind of outsized political status as a sheer effect of levels of wealth that we've never seen before.
I mean, it was just released that Elon Musk is probably gonna be the first trillionaire in the planet's history.
Well, I know that he and Bezos
soon
are sort of, both in a bit of a race for that status. So this is pretty crazy. But, and so there's that, which is that it is a bit like having a kind of, it's a bit like having a prominent dignitary from, whatever, a president from another country or a previous president there. I mean, they have that kind of status. I think the other thing is we know, and there's now been quite a lot written about the fact that Silicon Valley has done a kind of 180. It's kind of pivoted towards a more MAGA-like agenda. I mean, I mentioned Mark Andreessen earlier, and that he's one example of that. But I mean, Zuckerberg has sort of tried to renounce elements of a DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion agenda, and so-called woke values. There's been some of that ideological shift going on in the background. I mean, there was this often gets referred to as the vibe shift, which after there was a rather silly article in the New York Times, was it New York Times or New York Magazine? I think early 2022, talking about the kind of basically the right wing anti-woke ideology had become kind of cool. So there was a sense that these companies were no longer afraid of getting into bed with someone who might be considered who would be considered to be a racist and a reactionary and a all sorts of other things, and that they don't feel so concerned about how that was going to harm them reputationally, because one of the I think correct claims about what sometimes called woke capital is that for a good many years under Obama and afterwards, so the values of the what might be called the social movement in the 1960s on gay rights, on the anti-racism, on feminism, that these values have been kind of co-opted by corporate America as a way of trying to sort of sell more goods, and this was something that many people in things like hedge funds and certain corners of Silicon Valley and venture capitalists found to be kind of ridiculous and preposterous, and wanted to kind of push back against via Trump and so on. And I think that pushback has succeeded now, in the sense that there is now a lot of talk of DEI programs being rolled back. There was this thing about people taking their pronouns out of their biogs from LinkedIn and that kind of stuff, as a way of trying to show that they were now with this new sort of post woke cultural agenda. And I think that played some role. But I mean, ultimately, people like ultimately it's business self-interest for people like Zuckerberg.
Don't you think this is
Bezos.
like pure opportunism, that if the Democrats win again, a lot of these guys are just going to flip right back into their previous
sure. But I think the fact is that I think that the economic and the cultural and the political tendencies were sort of pulling. We're in alignment to some extent.
I mean, this new tech bro element in the whole equation is fascinating. What do you think these fellas are actually after? Because they sure harbor some pretty strange ideas. I don't know if you've seen this, but Peter Thiel is apparently organizing a 4-part lecture on the Antichrist soon.
Oh wow!
Who
No, I
he
didn't know
also
that.
recently said, I believe that it's probably Greta Thunberg.
Yeah.
What is going on here with these people?
Well, teal is obviously a sort of one-off, really. I mean, there's lots to be said about teal, and there's been lots written about teal, because teal is, in some ways, the one constant in all of this. I mean, he's stuck fairly closely to his agenda ever since being at Stanford in the late 1980s, and he's used his networks and his money to keep this kind of agenda alive. And obviously he has he was a part of the PayPal mafia with Musk. He was also the person who has supported Curtis Yarvin, the neo-reactionary
Monarchist.
political guru. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Teal's moment has definitely arrived. I think Teal would like to think of himself as a philosopher and a proper intellectual, but take away all of his billions, and it's not clear kind of what they would be exactly. He'd be more like a kind of blogger or a sort of pamphleteer. It's not like the people who they cling to are not always particularly sort of sophisticated thinkers, but they're extremely well capitalized ones. I mean, Yarvin, I haven't read all of the Dark Enlightenment stuff, but I mean, a lot of what he says and thinks seems to be fairly kind of crass kind of things that, you could imagine a sort of 16-year-old gamer kind of coming out with quite a lot of this stuff.
But what is it? What is it? Because I'm not familiar.
It's the idea that democracy democracy has had its day, and that the corporate form, the benefit of capitalism is that there is the opportunity to exit. So if I don't like a company that I'm invested in or that I work for, or a product that I'm buying and so on, what capitalism offers me is the ability to withdraw and go elsewhere. So this is a distinction that is in the ideas of the economic historian Albert Hirschman, who talks about exit and voice as two different ways of expressing discontent in economic life. And voice is what you do when you turn up to a meeting and you say, look, I think we should do things differently, like via a trade union or something. I mean, Yarvin basically sees democracy, that the democracy doesn't work. Democracy holds us all back and it's kind of got an air of sort of Nietzschean critique of equality about it, because in a sense, what it's not allowing to happen is the kind of flourishing of the minority of truly kind of elite or
that sounds like a
individuals.
regurgitation of like Ayn Rand and Fountainhead.
It's not that dissimilar. That's right. But it goes further into saying that effectively that a corporation, say take Amazon, is a little bit like a monarchy, with Jeff Bezos as the king. But there is nevertheless the opportunity for the employees to leave and go and work somewhere else. And Yarvin's vision of the international system is that you would have a kind of series of monarchical corporate entities in which people were at liberty to leave if they didn't like the way it was being run. Now, of course, that also, it's also quite racist. So there would also be, I don't know exactly how it fits together with other dimensions of immigration and globalization. But there's the vision, and this is where you get the kind of, again, a kind of authoritarian libertarianism, which is that real political freedom would be the freedom to go and set up states along the lines roughly like the founder of a Silicon Valley startup, and then people who wanted to join that state would be able to do so, but on terms that were made clear from the outset. Quinn Slobodian, who I mentioned earlier, his book Hayek's Bastards, he has another book recently. He's been very, very productive in recent years, called Crack Up Capitalism, and that is about the dreams. I think the subtitle is something like Capitalism and the Dream of a World Without Democracy. And in that book, he argues that for a long time, many libertarians and neoliberals had long looked at Hong Kong as being and this was while Hong Kong was still a territory of the United Kingdom, exactly, protected.
Yeah.
And it was this outpost. It was a city, effectively a city-state in which capitalism governed, but it was not a democracy. It was not communist. It was a city-state that was governed by the logic of capitalism. Singapore often gets held up by a lot of these sorts of people as being another kind of example, and increasingly at the moment, Dubai would be the other instance of this. And there's a little right-wing meme. I mean, particularly amongst sometimes sort of discontented in my country, in Britain, there's this thing that goes around, right-wing commentators, but also some of the sort of, I guess, sort of resentful nationalists, sort of Brexit voters, that this country's finished. It's full of woke bullshit, and it's got too much immigration. I'm moving to Dubai. This is always the thing. It's like, I'm going to go to Dubai because they've got proper sort of property rights, low taxes. It's run according to transparent principles of the market, and it's got better weather and that kind of stuff. So there's a certain sort of idea that the 20th century liberal democracy, with its welfare state and its civil rights and its rule of law, this whole thing has been outmoded by the rise of platform capitalism, the rise of these kind of more nimble, low tax city states where you don't worry about things like human rights and voice and democracy, because all of those things are holding you back. And in a way, I think this is where someone like Peter Thiel and someone like Alex Karp, who is the founder of and chief executive of Palantir, which was obviously initially supported by Thiel and by the CIA.
That guy's terrifying, I have to be honest.
No, he is. And if you read his book, Technological Republic, I mean, he basically argues that Silicon Valley has lost its way because it's become too focused on consumers and users, and it needs to start putting all of its resources behind preparing for war, basically, creating things like AI-led killer drones and this sort of thing. So he's pretty crazy. He was also a PhD student of Habermas. He's got this weird background in German.
I think he studied in Germany, actually.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. And the book, if you read Technological Republic, he's quite keen to sort of display that he's kind of got some philosophical background. But Karp and Thiel, I think part of what drives them now is they look at China. They can see that Chinese capitalism has achieved things over the last 20 years that US capitalism would be completely incapable of achieving in terms of the development of infrastructures and cities and new energy resources and so on. And would, I think, partly take away a lesson that this is possible because they don't have things like human rights and democracy getting in the way, and that there's that we're now in a more of a sort of something more like a kind of Schumpeterian battle between rival entrepreneurs. That global economy could be understood more along the lines of a competition between corporate forms than of different sort of polities or constitutional forms.
Why do you think these guys? By the way, it was really funny how they talk about Singapore and Hong Kong and what was the third one, Dubai, and these are all like non-white countries or cities.
Yeah.
But why do you think these guys are latching on to these like more crackpot thinkers? Why aren't they reading like Adam Smith and Karl Marx?
Well, Karl Marx, I think we know why they're not reading Karl Marx.
Okay, fair enough.
Adam Smith. They're not going to. There's nothing they would find in Adam Smith that would be useful to them at all. But
I meant what was like, even if in opposition, they seem like they haven't even read like the basic stuff first. No, that's what I meant.
I think one thing we need to understand, and Thiel is, I think, again, a kind of key, a constant thread in all of this, is that they would argue that higher education, the Western university, has been captured by the left, and I guess they would say it was captured by the left in the 1960s. So you have, like the kind of new left was a product of, but the Frankfurt School would be, yes, exactly. That would be one, and there's a whole conspiracy theory around how the Frankfurt School kind of injected Marxism into US
Stalin
universities
from the grave. Yes.
Yeah, right. And other aspects of what they call cultural Marxism of Gramsci and so on. But I think they would say that, which is correctly, that the American New Left is something that began in Berkeley. It began on campuses, and it was heavily tied up with anti-Vietnam movements. I mean, obviously also with free speech movement in Berkeley. There's a kind of irony there, because I think, and there are figures of the New Left who flipped wholly to the kind of libertarian right. People like David Horowitz, whose son ended up creating the venture capital fund that Mark Andreessen works with. It's called Andreessen Horowitz. Also someone like Murray Rothbard and Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was actually an anarchist in his youth. I think was he from Brooklyn or the Bronx, and he was from New York City. But so there's some of these sort of people who sort of flip. Partly because I think they develop a kind of disgust with their own kind of left-wing peers. But yeah, they would say that universities have been fully co-opted by the left, and therefore you have to sort of operate outside of it. And Thiel was always of that view. I mean, he was at Stanford whenever it was, late 80s, early 90s, and he created a philosophy journal called the Stanford Review, but it was very much a kind of aim to be sort of heterodox, so the capture of ideas that were not basically being given what he thought was proper recognition by the philosophy department or by the academy. And Thiel had this. I don't know if he still has it, but he has this fellowship program where he literally pays people large sums of money to just drop out of university. I mean, he's so convinced that being at university is a kind of way of brainwashing you into woke ideology, that a lot of this is about trying to circumvent universities, farm universities, get people get a kind of an intellectual infrastructure outside of universities. I mean, the neoliberals did something a little bit similar with things like their think tanks and Montpellier Society and so on. And it's true that someone like Friedrich Hayek, until he got to Chicago, I mean, Hayek ended up with quite a comfortable sort of life in the later years, but he was a bit of a nomad for a while, between Vienna and LSE, and sort of making trips over to the United States and back and so on. So there were some commonalities there, but I think now people like Thiel and Musk and the people around MAGA would not almost distrust things that had a kind of university stamp of approval on them. So I think that's the key issue. I mean, one of the things is, I think maybe so why they're not reading Adam Smith or Karl Marx to me is relatively clear. I think one of the questions is, if the World Bank was to put out a document with some empirical analysis, which I'm sure it has done, showing that tariffs are going to be bad for, because ultimately the only measure that Trump really cares about is the stock market. He doesn't really care about jobs or GDP or any of these other things. It's the stock market and asset values, because he's a real estate developer. But if if the World Bank was to come out and show that tariffs were going to be bad for property developers in New York City and for the stock market, would they take that seriously, or would they convince themselves that even the World Bank was woke and prejudiced and in bed with the liberals and so on? I don't know. I mean, that's the interesting thing, because there's so much, and a lot of this is being played out at the moment in the kind of battle against the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is a kind of bastion of a certain form of small L liberal expertise and economic, sort of financial elitism. Surely there must be something that there must be weapons within some of these institutions that they actually want, and resources and insight and knowledge. There must be a limit to their stupidity, if you like. Maybe not when it comes to health policy. It's not clear that Robert Kennedy is going to encounter those limits, but you might think that Besant, the Treasury Secretary, would not want to engage in acts of complete sort of wanton self-destruction, but I guess we'll see.
You wrote a lot about the rise of anti-expert sentiment as well as populism. How do we come to a moment where the fringe opinions of, let's say, a mixed martial arts commentator reach millions of eager ears, carrying actual weight, while the opinions of the world's most eminent scientists, doctors, and climatologists are literally ridiculed, dismissed, or presented as part of some crazy conspiracy?
Yeah, I mean, so the most proximate answer to that question is social media, obviously, because it wasn't possible before social media for that to occur. There were always people, there were pamphleteers, there were people on soapboxes on street corners ranting and raving, and all of those things were possible. But ultimately, the bottleneck of broadcast technology and print technology meant that it was not possible to reach mass audiences via these other means. I mean, I think that's obviously one part of the answer, is that it's simply now possible. I think the question is, I suppose, part of this involves the question of what forms of more existential insecurity and anxiety and confusion are people experiencing, that the news as provided to them by CNN or the Financial Times or the health authorities or whatever it might be does not satisfy. That on some level that there is something that seems wrong with the world, something that seems wrong often on a very sort of personal level in one's own life, which is not being adequately represented or reflected by things like, I mean, as I write about in Nervous States, things like statistics and forms of kind of liberal empirical objectivity that can be dated back to the scientific revolution in the 17th century, that they do not satisfy the need for certain forms of truth about a world that feels out of joint in some ways. And I think in order to get heard in online spaces such as TikTok and Instagram Reels and YouTube and so on, a lot of truth claims that get validated and achieve virality have to get packaged up in the spirit of denunciation and of anger, which is that, you know, so and so is telling you something and they're wrong, or so and so claims to be good but they're bad, or so and so is claiming that something is true but actually it's false, and they're saying that something's false but actually it's true. So that this way of communicating, which I suppose it's interesting because it's sometimes that's conspiracy theory, which is to say, you know, they told you that 9/11 was an Al-Qaeda attack, but actually it wasn't. But it also has some of the rhetorical forms of what academics would call critical realism, because it's kind of saying, or Marx, you know, Marxism would be an example of critical realism. So Marxism says, behind the story about free trade actually lies a more true story about exploitation of labor from one class to the other, and that you're being told a lie, basically. There seems to be some need that maybe people have always had, but they feel it more intensely at certain moments of economic and political crisis, but a need to hear and to affirm stories that have that structure of so-and-so says it is true, but it's not, or so-and-so is telling you this, but they're a liar. So that's clearly what someone like Rogan can communicate, or other forms of sort of COVID era conspiracy theories. I think that we know that liberal democracies have suffered a major legitimation crisis that is much older than social media as well, which is captured. One of the areas where I try to capture this a bit in some of the writing I did on this is in these surveys on trust, which can be a bit clunky, but they tell you some interesting things. Actually, trust in doctors and scientists and judges, these are all kind of liberal elites. The trust in these different professions has remained reasonably steady, even in the United States, when it comes to things like doctors and scientists over the last 30 years. But there's two figures in the public sphere where it has collapsed, and those are professional politicians and journalists. And if the idea of the kind of functioning liberal public sphere that, you know, liberal philosophers such as Jürgen Habermas, to mention him again, have tried to defend over his long career, is not possible if the mediators of that public sphere and the key protagonists of it are considered to be liars. The whole thing just doesn't work any longer. And in that sense, there is then a need for a different form of existential embedding. And I think that's where some of these other online voices start to come in, which is to give people a sense of identity and security in the world. And even if it's kind of palpably bullshit like QAnon, simply by repeating it and sharing it, it achieves some form of community and some form of coherence in a world that otherwise just seems utterly overwhelming and confusing.
Yeah, what happened to QAnon, by the way? There was so much talk about all of these revelations and predictions, and
Makes
it's
you
very
think.
anticlimactic. Yeah.
Well, I know, but I mean, the claim of QAnon was that there was an international network that involved lots of elites,
I see what you did
In that
there.
sense, it was
Yeah.
well, no, but it's true. No, but there is an interesting issue. I mean, this happens with a lot of conspiracy theories. Is that on some level it speaks to something that, I mean, I'm not saying that the QAnon was a direct connection to Epstein, but it's when you look at what's now coming out and the birthday party, the birthday cards to
Yeah.
Epstein from everyone and everyone. But it's like, I mean, there's a very good book which I'd recommend, which is Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger, which is about how elements of a left-wing critique and elements of a kind of radical right critique do join up in certain respects. So, for instance, she uses examples such as that, particularly during COVID, there was a lot of kind of big tech paranoia. They're trying to control you, and your mobile phone is spreading COVID and this sort of stuff. So like, well, or the vaccines are going to harm your child and so on. But actually, there is something wrong with big tech, and there is something wrong with big pharma, and there are shady cabals of international elites. And I mean, it's interesting. The example that really jumped directly from a kind of left-wing critique to a right-wing conspiracy theory was that of Davos and the World Economic Forum, because straight after COVID, Davos, its first meeting, which I guess was early 2021 or 22, had this phrase, the Great Reset, which was meant to be,
I
let's have a
remember
new
that.
capitalism.
Yeah.
And this term got kind of picked up by online right-wing
It was
voices and
all over
conspiracy
Twitter.
theorists.
Yeah.
That's right. Which was that Klaus Schwab, who was he's the Swiss founder of the World Economic Forum, and he comes from a business school background. He became like the center of various conspiracy theories that were taking off. And it's interesting because I myself, I mean, I was part of my PhD. I was quite interested in the World Economic Forum, and I interviewed people about it. And I was not that I thought it was a conspiracy, but clearly things that happened behind closed doors, which involved Bill Gates and Bono and Nelson Mandela and Tony Blair, whatever. There is something intriguing and troubling about a form of politics that seems completely opaque and immune to democratic pressure. So there's something has got very, very muddled up. And there are people who, I don't follow people like Joe Rogan, but I've heard people say that actually, you look at, say, the power of BlackRock, the asset management firm in global capitalism today, where it owns huge swathes of the US stock market, are basically across, hundreds and hundreds of companies, all owned by a single single asset manager. Joe Rogan, I'm told by someone I know who looks at corporate governance from a critical lens, he's doing far more to try and alert his listeners to this sort of problem than a lot of sort of so-called centrist liberal podcasts who are just sort of think, Wall Street's all
Those
kind
are the
of,
worst.
that's how.
Yeah.
But actually, there is so it's not clear exactly what is an entirely left-wing and a right-wing agenda when it comes to this attempt to kind of unveil and denounce the status quo.
Fair enough. I know you have to go, so last question, Professor. How the hell do we get out of this colossal bind? I mean, whatever we're going through right now, it's certainly quite an unpleasant moment. Do you think it would be possible to just collectively say, "Hey guys, we should just stop everything we're doing right now, hold hands, and walk back into the 90s together"?
No, I don't think that at all. I mean, I don't think that at all. No, I know.
There goes
I mean,
my evening. Yeah.
I mean, I guess the governing assumption of this conversation has been that democratic alternatives are preferable. I think that we are also still living in a time of quite vibrant democratic activity. There is authoritarian threats to that democratic activity, but there are new parties being formed, new leaders coming through. There is evidence amongst younger generations that their values are completely out of kilter with a lot of where these kind of gerontocratic reactionary agendas are coming from. And I think that we have to keep on going through this. We can't. I think one of the things that worries me a bit at the moment is, and this has been written a bit about by various people, but that if the problem that the left and the centre has, certainly the centre left, the liberal centre, liberal left, is that it constantly is just defending things the whole time. It's defending universities. It's defending particular aspects of the constitution. In Britain, we have this debate going on. It wasn't a debate a couple of years ago, but it is now apparently, which is that should Britain withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights as a way to try to reduce
Stop
its
immigration.
obligations
Yeah.
towards, asylum seekers in particular. And one of the difficulties with this is that uh, when it gets debated, the people who are trying to ultimately defend the rights of refugees end up just sort of saying, we must defend this piece of paper at all costs. It was drafted straight after this horrific the horrific events of the mid 20th century, and we must just simply sort of stand by it. And you can see how to certain ears it could seem very kind of conservative and in some ways quite unreasoning as well, because it ends up being a sort of digging one's heels in defense of what already exists, rather than envisioning something that doesn't yet exist in the future that might actually be better. And that's really where I think things have got very, very stuck on the centre and left. And that's, I think, partly a symptom of the neoliberalism of the last 30, 40 years, is that there's been a kind of a deadening of political imagination. I think that Trump has demonstrated an ability to kind of disrupt the status quo to a greater extent that people realized was possible, and that I think is opening up a lot of questions elsewhere in the world about what's possible regarding whether it be central banks or national borders, or already this whole question about DEI, this sort of cultural agenda inside institutions has gone global. But that opening up, there's no reason why it's only the right that can kind of exploit some of that sort of greater political fluidity. So I mean, that's, I guess, about as hopeful as I would get right now. But I think that the problem is that as the world gets scarier, people go in search of more extreme sources of security, and that the quest for security becomes stronger, and that is a gift to authoritarianism. But it's very difficult. I mean, in Britain we saw this with the Brexit referendum in 2016, that the side that was defending openness, liberalism, markets, and so on, just looked like it had no real politics. It hadn't really learned anything about the state of the world. It looked just rigid and inflexible. And the side that was basically saying, well, what happens if we just blow all those things up, looked like it was willing to kind of take risks and move into the future to some extent. And that's a very difficult politics to get out of.
Do you think the win of somebody like Zoran Mamdani in New York could be that watershed moment for the left?
I mean, I wouldn't exaggerate how significant it is globally, but I do think that he is a lesson to lots of left-wing political. Yeah, no, for sure. I think there's a lesson to political leaders everywhere, that he's very good at avoiding getting dragged into topics that he doesn't have anything to gain from talking about. He's very good at exuding optimism and hope. He doesn't talk about the right very much, actually. He talks about what he wants to do rather than what they're doing. And that, I think, is so important. But also he doesn't, he might be a socialist, he might not be a socialist, but ultimately what you call him and what kind of ideology you might think he has is less important than what he's promising to do. And I think that is something that left-wing parties need to learn from. And he makes politics look quite fun as well. I mean, there's a certain sort of affective disposition that he has that is something that lots of people can learn from. I mean, I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had some of this as well, and also still does. But there were those sorts of leaders that I think despite not having a strong left-wing history or just a socialist party history in the United States, it seems to do a better job of producing the leaders of this generation. I mean, obviously there's been the instances of things like Podemos and so on in Spain and so on. But I think that there's a charisma there, and there's a willingness to actually talk about the things that they want to talk about, and not just get dragged around onto other people's topics. I think that's so important. It's very difficult, particularly in the age of social media, which is a kind of reactive medium, where you end up people. I mean, we're not even sure, we talked about Charlie Kirk earlier, but the British media has been filled with stuff about Charlie Kirk for the last couple of days. Most people had never heard of Charlie Kirk 3 days ago in this country. I mean, and it's sort of like something that the right wants to make the topic ends up being able to somehow to sort of dominate everything else. I'm not saying that it's not significant, but its significance is being heavily inflated, given how many people get shot in the United States each year.
Exactly.
By the right.
Have you seen that completely bonkers video of the members of the European Parliament observing a 1-minute silence for Charlie Kirk?
Oh my God, I did not know that. I mean, that is insane. I mean, what the hell? I mean, that is. I'm leaving aside what he stands for. I mean, anyway, that's just crazy. But yeah.
Professor, thank you so much for your
It's
time.
been a pleasure.
Do you have any social media where people can follow? I think you used to have Twitter account because I was reading it.
I'm on Bluesky on Will.Davis.
You switched
and
up.
I have a
okay.
And I have a website at williamdavis.blog.
All right, perfect. We will link those in the description. Thanks. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow and rate on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Every marketing tutorial out there insists it's really important that I hassle you about this, so I'm doing it right now. Also, if you'd like to, please support me on Patreon. This is a one-person podcast, as I always say. I do everything by my little old self. There's no team behind me. It's very sad, I know, but you can help by hopping on Patreon and finding the Smart Cookies podcast on there. And then last but certainly not least, as always, I have to thank my existing patrons. Tovarishin Tovarishice, absolute legends. Without you, there would be no Smart Cookies, which makes you actual producers of this show. So eternal thanks goes to Amy Jons, Matija Renčel, Florian Hauer, Peter Karva, Matija Zupančič, Dejan Žolnir, Derej, Rok Tržan, Saša Vipatnik, Neven Cvijanović, Juš Premrov, Sirkezi, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaš Maher, Štrole, Ajda Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinjo, Goran, Gordon, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen Veronica, and Tai Chi. I am deeply touched, so thank you very much.